Leadership Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Leadership Story Talks is produced by Narrative, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
Welcome to Leadership Story Talks. I'm Jerome DeRoy, CEO of Narrative.
I'm Julienne Ryan.
Hi, Jules. And today our guest is Heather Hansen, who helps top global professionals show up, speak up, and inspire action in a changing world. She is on a mission to empower global voices to contribute to conversations that matter, whether that's business, politics, or life. Only through conscious, confident, and connected communication can we achieve our collective potential and peacefully solve the world's greatest challenges. Heather's 2018 TEDx talk titled 2 Billion Voices, How to Speak Bad English Perfectly, has had over 200,000 views and is used by many university professors and English language specialists in their own teachings. Heather's also an external industry expert in communication for National University of Singapore Business School's executive education programs. Her latest book, Unmuted, outlines her framework for successful global communication in multinational companies and was published by Bloomsbury Business in the UK in March 2022. Heather, welcome to the show.
Welcome.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's
How are
delighted.
you, Jules?
Yes. So you had me at the title of your YouTube talk. So I've been intrigued ever since then. And I'm so curious to find out what led you to write your book, Unmuted.
It was a combination of a few things. We had just gone into the pandemic and onto video calls. And the first thing out of everyone's mouth on every single call was, "You're on mute, you're on mute, you're on mute." And after some reflection, I thought, there's a lot of people who have been on mute long before video calls, right? That have been sitting in boardrooms, who have not been speaking up, who have been ignored, who haven't been heard, who have been either placed on mute or have been pressing that mute button themselves. And that was the main reason I wanted to write that book at that time. A couple of other things that contributed as well was being a frustrated trainer and having HR call me at the end of the year saying, "We want to work on communication skills next year. Can you come and do a one-day presentation skills course?" And it's like, that's not going to change anything, really. Communication is about culture. It's about how we work together in the organization. We can't fix something like that in one day with one small skill set. So Unmuted was written to be a much more holistic view of how communication actually works and how it affects and impacts culture in an organization. And then I think the last thing that contributed was just overall frustration with the world today. We've been losing trust in our leaders all across the world. It doesn't matter which country you're in. And it seems like there are just so many problems everywhere, from environmental, and also, we were having the health crisis of the pandemic. We have war, we have all of these things happening. And I thought, this can't be the pinnacle of human potential, right? There have to be better ideas out there somewhere. And either people aren't speaking up and sharing them, or we are not listening. So those are the three things that came together all at the same time, where I felt this book has to come out to the world. I have to talk about this.
Yeah. Yeah. And thank you for writing that, because I feel like that is a sentiment and a feeling that a lot of people had and still have. And it's interesting how, you talked about the pandemic and this term that we all know, please unmute yourself if you're going to be speaking. And it seems like that was the catalyst, essentially, or the aha moment. And it seems like there were so many aha moments for so many people during the pandemic. I'm always fascinated by how the pandemic seems to have accelerated certain innovations or certain reflections. And I wonder, from your perspective, that's where you start in terms of, that's where it sort of all came together for you. But I wonder, where, because I also know about your TEDx talk, which is about, the English language and the many ways that people speak English. How much of that sort of, how long has this been in gestation? I know you talked about the pandemic, but I'm curious about, what are the the observations, because you said through observation, you came to this conclusion. And I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more about those observations, and then, of course, what the book itself, what are those kinds of, diagnostics that you might have made?
Yeah, so that's a really good question and observation wrapped in one, because of course, this book has been in my mind and on my heart probably my whole career. And it's the culmination of all the different kinds of work that I do with my clients. I started my company here in Singapore in 2007. And every single one of the clients who come to me is on mute in some way. So they could be on the cusp of the C-suite and they're being told your communication skills aren't good enough, or you don't have the presence to represent us internationally, or you're not global enough, or all of these different sort of excuses and complaints around the way that they show up, speak up, and impact the world around them. And that's the side of the equation that I've been working on for the whole first half of my career, is how do I help these individuals fit in and meet the expectations of a very Western, English speaking, and quite biased and discriminatory world, so that their voices can be heard. These minority voices can be heard. And now I feel like with Unmuted, it was the first step I was taking to try to flip this equation. Because where I've always really wanted to focus my attention is on the rest of the world and saying, listen, we need to start listening better. We need to start recognizing these voices. We need to start inviting everyone to the table if we want to have innovation and growth, because we're losing half our talent here or more, because we're hugely outnumbered as native English speakers, which there's a lot of ways to define that term. But the fact that we have this immediate power and dominance in the world due to our eloquence in English, I see as a massive inequality. And so this has been building and growing my whole career, where everything I've done is around cross-cultural communication, speaking for understanding, listening to understand, listening to the meaning behind the message, not the way it's communicated. This is why the TEDx came about in 2018. I felt like maybe the world was ready to start hearing some of these messages, because even today, the concept of accent bias, linguistic bias is still relatively unknown. And so I've been sort of waiting for this whole DEI movement to where we can begin talking about these things. So that's the backstory that led up to the pandemic. And then a lot of different things happening in the world that led to more discussions around diversity and inclusion, which allowed for this book to be written at this time. So you're absolutely right. There was a lot behind that.
Yeah, and thanks for that, because I think it's also important to understand that what we mean by the linguistic bias and accent bias, and it's fascinating to hear how that's kind of driven your work and up to right now. So thanks for elaborating on that. I think, Jules, you were about to say something, it seems.
I was just commenting and acknowledging, because what you get for feedback saying this person needs assistance is code for what is that standard in the model of what the appropriate avatar needs to be to launch that product out. So I'm just curious. And we probably, if you can touch on that a little bit and see how you're able to maybe influence that perception.
Yeah, and that's what is so hard, because they come with this code of communication skills, professional presence, gravitas, language skills, and I have to really dig and say, this means nothing to me. What exactly do you want them to change? What do we need to do for them to get that promotion, or for them to be seen as a leader, or for them to be put on those global stages, or get the important clients that they want to work with? What is it exactly you need them to do? And every person who calls me is a little bit different, because yes, sometimes it's the individual coming to me, but very often it's the HR or the higher level leader who is calling me saying, I need you to fix this person, even though they don't use that word. That's what they're saying. I need you to fix them. I need you to make them more like me, or more like other leaders in the organization, or more like the, Steve Jobs, or like who's our model here? What's our target? And when I really, really dig, eventually things like, well, they just sound too Singaporean, even though the person calling me is Singaporean, their whole board of directors is Singaporean. But for some reason, their accent or the way they speak is not seen as global enough, whatever that means. So you're exactly right, Julian, in saying these are all codes. And my argument, or what I've come to believe is true through all of this and through my experience, is that it's code for saying, we don't like this particular accent. We don't like the way that they speak. And that's what most of my work has revolved around, is, okay, how do we make this person sound more global? How do we make them better understood globally? And I try to do it in a way that is not in any way changing the accent, but is focused on intelligibility and clarity. And that's a major distinction I want to make, because there's an entire industry of people making millions of dollars on accent reduction and accent neutralization. And I have distanced myself from that industry as much as possible, because I don't believe in that at all. And that's taking away identity. It's changing all of the culture a person brings with them, and we should be celebrating that.
Thank you.
And it takes away from the word that kept coming back to me as you were explaining this is authenticity. It's very difficult to be authentic when you're trying to discuss especially when you're trying to code something with something else. And so and essentially what you're communicating to your personnel is that you need to be fixed, or there's something wrong, essentially. And it reminds me a lot of, in our work around storytelling, a lot of times clients will say, we want this person to be as good a storyteller as that other person, the CEO, or when you mentioned Steve Jobs, that's when kind of the light bulb went off, because I've heard that so many times in the context of presentations, communications, et cetera. That's sort of and his talks have been, analyzed and dissected, and this is how you do it if you want to be just as good as him. But the problem that we've seen is that it takes away from your own true, authentic story. And it sounds like with your work, it's quite similar. And the term used here is voice and language, right? And I think once you start to tell somebody that, their voice or their language is not right, or it's the wrong way to speak, it does something to your own authenticity, and you show up in a way that just doesn't seem natural. And it just kind of compounds the problem, as opposed to trying to solve the very issue that you're being called for. Does that make sense to you, Heather?
Yeah, that absolutely resonates. It absolutely resonates, because that's usually the biggest struggle, is they try to start implementing or changing these very little things, even if it's something like making sure they pronounce word endings, which is something we should all be doing. But even for me as an American to focus on pronouncing all of my word endings, it makes me feel very odd. And it makes me feel like, but this isn't how I talk, and this isn't me. And how can I show my personality if I have to articulate every single D and T ending? And it makes me feel more staccato, and it makes me so we have all of these weird feelings that come up, because we are changing something that's so inherent, so innate in us. And then the other problem is the reactions we get from others when we start making these changes. So especially in a Singapore context, when a Singaporean starts trying to change the way they speak or sound different, it is immediately noticed by the local population, where they'll react and say, "What, you think you're better than us now? Why are you talking like that? We don't say it like that. Why are you changing the way that you speak?" And so our language also gives us our identity in our groups. And when we then make a change, people start to question, what is your reason for that change? And so people can recognize right away when something isn't authentic and isn't in alignment with the normal culture. So that's another big roadblock that people run up against, and they really shouldn't have to, they shouldn't have to do that. But we know that it can make a big change for whatever the goal is, if it's getting on that global stage or whatever. But in the meantime, it could be ruining the relationships of the team dynamics themselves, because of that inauthenticity that is perceived by the people who know them well.
The the word that came to mind in this case was shame. Like I understand you're saying develop eloquence and clarity so somebody could comprehend what you're saying, but to say, well, your accent is nothing to be proud of, and or you're less than. So you have folks, you're saying we're embracing diversity, and those individuals are struggling, like many of us, imposter syndrome, layer the fact you can't even speak the way you feel comfortable or use your energy or dynamics. That's concerning. And it's always been that. It's, we are not the first generation to deal with it. I mean, look what Hollywood did years ago when the film industry started with sound. They started to change how we looked at how we speak with others and what was appropriate and not.
Absolutely. And it's true all over the world too. And every culture has different ideas of how we should be showing up. A typical American style is pretty much rejected in Europe. I mean, when I lived in Denmark, I was too big, I was too loud, I was too much, I smile too much, I'm superficial, I'm inauthentic, I mean, you name it. I tick all the boxes. And so every culture, society has different ways of looking at this. I think it's also important to recognize within our countries themselves, this isn't just a native, non-native sort of thing. We have regional variations in the way that we speak in every language, everywhere in the world. Looking at the United States, we all know that a Southern accent has certain characteristics tied to that, where they've been depicted in movies and film, as you bring up, Julian, the way that we depict the way people speak and the characteristics we give to them to stereotype certain groups. If you look at the animated cartoon Cars, there's this old beat up pickup truck with a Southern accent, and he's real sort of, dopey and but warm-hearted and kind and hospitable and welcoming, all the wonderful things that we equate with the Southern states, but he's not so bright, right? And then in the end, they sort of make him he's a lot smarter than everyone thinks, which is exactly what ends up happening, right? But why should they have to prove themselves? I have a friend from Alabama, and she went to work on Wall Street and was called Pollyanna for her entire career there, eventually left, moved to the UK, where she's now a professional speaker, and everyone loves and appreciates the difference and the diversity she brings with that Southern charm. So it happens not just in international environments where we're coming with different linguistic backgrounds. It can happen in our own languages as well, and the way that we stereotype and think about others from our own country and our own language. Even British accents, the way we think of them, and they're every bad guy in the movies, So there's a lot at play and a lot at work. And then how that shows up in business when we suddenly have a colleague who sounds different or speaks different. It can lead to a lot of interesting situations.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, the subject of language and linguistics, and how the kinds of stereotypes and assumptions we make just based on how a person speaks. And I'm wondering, back to the book Unmuted, and this idea of becoming unmuted. Could you describe some of the elements that are needed in order for people to, for lack of a better term, and I'm sure it's much better if you read the book, which I encourage everybody to do, but to become quote unquote unmuted. What are some of those elements? Could you describe that?
Yeah, there are three basic elements. So the framework I've created is a Venn diagram. Everyone loves a good Venn, and it's these three areas. So the first one is conscious communication. The very first chapter of the book is who are you? It's looking at self-awareness, your own values, how you're living those values, how you're showing up in the world. Conscious communication is all about how you're showing up. It's cultural intelligence, cross-cultural communication, reading the room, knowing when you're dominating the conversation, knowing how to turn down your voice, being conscious of those around us. The next bubble is confident communication, and that's both your self-worth and self-confidence, but also your skills confidence. So I don't want it to sound like I think training isn't important. We still need those presentation skills courses and how to write good emails and how to negotiate and all those soft skills. But my argument is that they're a small piece of the puzzle, but this is the area where that would come up. We do need, of course, the skills to know how to unmute and show up and speak up in the world. So confidence is about speaking up. And then the last bit is connected communication. And this is how we're impacting one another, creating impact in the world. And that's about our relationships, creating psychological safety, feeling a sense of belonging. How are we interacting with one another? What are the rules of engagement that we have in our teams and in our company? So my argument is that we need all three of these areas in equal measure in order to be truly unmuted. Because if we're off balanced, if, for example, we're missing that conscious communication, but we're very confident and connected, that overlap is too loud. Our voices are too loud. We end up dominating. We don't even realize that we're talking over people, interrupting people, speaking for the whole conversation, and that we need to turn down our voice because we're just lacking a bit of that consciousness in our communication. And we see these different overlaps happening. If you don't feel a sense of belonging, that's when you're on mute. If you don't have the confidence, then you're usually turning down your voice and not speaking up to your full potential. So that's the overview of the framework. And when we have all those areas as an individual, but also as a culture in the company, that's when we can all be unmuted and begin contributing in equal measure.
You know, what's great about this description is that it's kind of like a recipe, and you know, you put all these different ingredients, and not only, I'm hearing it in two different ways. Not only will it help people to sort of understand, you know, how to become unmuted, but also it seems like a really great, you know, visual or reminder for managers and employers and leaders of people to sort of look at, wait a second, when am I the loudest voice in the room? Why am I the loudest voice in the room? Why am I only the only one who always speaks? Maybe there's something going on in one of these, you know, three categories that we don't have enough of, or that I'm not encouraging enough. So it sounds to me like a great, like, you know, I keep coming back. Maybe it's because here in the US, it's close to dinner time. So so I'm talking about recipes, but it feels a little bit like a recipe book where, you know, you can sprinkle a little bit of those ingredients, a little bit of that. And as a manager, it seems like a really great tool.
Yeah, and it's important that managers are thinking about this, because a lot of our culture change needs to have the support of people at the top from our leaders. It's very difficult to create some of these changes within the teams, but I think it's important to also stress that you can be a leader at any level. Yes. And it's up to you to press unmute. You know, it's only the individual who can do it. So we have to take that responsibility as well. Sometimes we say, oh, well, it's this toxic leader and I'll never be able to speak up. But if you just stop trying and press mute, that isn't really helping the situation. So it is from both sides of the equation that we have to work on this.
And while you're thinking recipe, I was thinking about how many people I want to send this episode to, including my husband downstairs. So I'm like, I'm gonna figure out how to package that.
Yeah. And it depends on context as well, right? It depends on when you start talking about your husband and things like that, because you could be very loud in your family, but then show up at work in a very different way. Or you could, so depending on context, you can find yourself moving all around in this diagram. For example, when I speak English, I'm very, very confident, and I know that I can be too loud. I know that I jump in too fast because I have that confidence, and I think of something, I say it, right? But if I'm speaking in Danish, which I'm fluent, I lived there 8 years, I'm married to a Dane, we speak it at home, but I'm a very different person in Danish. And I won't be the first to raise my hand in the meeting. I won't volunteer to speak. I am very, very quiet. I'm a very different person. And I often say, if you don't know me in English, you really don't know me as a person, because I'm very different. My personality shows up in a very different way. And in those situations, depending on whether I feel a sense of belonging or not, I'm either too soft or I'm on mute. So depending on context, and that's something to really consider. How do you show up at home? How do you show up with your friends? How do you show up at work? What are the differences, and why? Why? What's going on there for you? And if you can identify that, I think there's a lot of learning and growth that can happen there.
And words and voice is like music. You have the notes, you have the pause, you have the cadence. and each language captures something very unique. And any friend when I hear them speaking in their native tongue, is so different. Just even the depth of the voice and what comes, it's a whole different transformation. So yeah, there's a whole beauty to it that we need to appreciate and ask ourselves what's getting in the way of our listening, like we always say.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Heather, in your work, if when you talk about this subject to businesses and work with business people, do you find that it's easier to, or actually I won't put any evaluation on it, but how do you find it when you're working with individuals as opposed to groups of people? How is this received? Because I would imagine that it's quite a sensitive topic, my accent, my identity, my voice, all of it, all, of course, it culminates in, essentially being a better communicator, no matter where you are. But I'm curious about how that happens in a business, and whether you find that, it's more efficient to work with groups or with individuals one-on-one.
That's a great question, because the minute I start talking about the too loud voice, I always see the light bulbs going off. Everyone going, I know who that person is, right? Except for the one guy in the room.
Right.
Who's going, and that's when I say, if you don't immediately know who this person is, it's probably you. And that's usually the way it works, right? But the way I go about it with groups is I've created an unmuted assessment, and this is a free addition to the book. Anyone can take this assessment. It's free online. You can go to heatherhansen.com/unmuted, and you can do the unmuted assessment. And what you will find is where you are on this Venn diagram. So when you take the assessment, you have to be thinking, I am considering my answers in this context, my work context, and assuming we're working with a group in a business. And you will get a report showing, okay, maybe you are too much on the conscious side and you're lacking the confidence and connection, or maybe your voice is too loud because you have the confidence and the connection. So it will give you I don't know how many page report showing all the different areas and what's lacking. So I use that as a start when I work with groups. So I get all of their individual responses, which are kept completely confidential. I don't even give that information to HR or any of the management. I say that from the start, it's completely confidential. And then I put together the team or department or company scores. And that's where things get interesting. So we'll start doing some separations according to gender, according to department, according to team, to see how is the company actually showing up? What is the current company communication culture? Is it too loud? Is it a bunch of people who all want their voices heard all the time? Is it that we have this huge segment of the company that isn't speaking up and we're completely losing their ideas because they're too soft or on mute? And so it gives us this screenshot. And when we see it on paper like that with no names attached, then people are able to start talking about it and go, wow, I have recognized that, or I do resonate with that, or actually, sometimes I do feel like I'm talked over and I can't speak up. So when we start looking at the actual questions, it raises a lot of eyebrows where people go, wow, and some are very surprised, some resonate with it a lot, but that is the door opener to the conversations at the group level, because I think we do have to be very sensitive about how we walk in and say, who's the dominant one and who isn't speaking up. It really isn't about finding what's wrong with people, because we need the loud voices too. They're the ones that drive the discussion, that speak up first, that make other people feel comfortable to add. Someone has to be the one to answer that question first. And so we need these people too. It's not all negative. There's pros and cons to all of this. And also understanding that it's not a personality assessment. We move through all these different roles at different times in different contexts. So there is no real good or bad. It's just about how do we find the balance? And when we approach it from that perspective, it's a little bit easier to talk about these concepts, a little bit easier.
Because I'm thinking, like, when you talk in terms of opportunity and then a loss. So can you give an example of maybe a case where you were able to lead your group or the team to be aware of what they were missing and where the opportunity was when they shifted their perspective and how they related to each other?
One of the questions that I ask in the assessment is whether you feel that your unique skill set is being valued at work, that you're actually being given the right tasks. And with one particular client we found at the team level, it was around 27%, if I remember correctly, somewhere between 25 and 30%, were saying they did not feel that their unique skill set was being used correctly in work. And that is a big problem. And they were pretty shocked when they saw that. It was one of those sort of look around the room, oh my gosh, like a third of us feel that we aren't being, that we aren't doing what we're here to do, and that's very scary, because those are the people who will become disengaged and leave the company first. So finding out just that one assessment question and finding out how the team felt about that and starting discussions around that led them to reorganize their performance evaluation reviews and how they were having those discussions, and really to start asking people, what is there something that we're overlooking? Is there a way that you could be contributing that you're not right now? Because sometimes we put people in these roles and they sit there and then they have this set of things that they have to do, when actually they have all these hidden talents that we've never really learned about. And so it forced them to start having those conversations and recognizing, oh, wow, you could actually be doing that. I had no idea you could do that. I didn't know you had that skill set or that experience. I don't know how that didn't come out before. Okay, let's shift our deliverables, or let's add this to your role, or let's take this away because that doesn't make sense. You're doing that when you could be doing this. So it led them to completely reevaluate the tasks that each person were responsible for, and how they were showing up and doing their work. And I mean, that's just a massive change that comes from just understanding the situation a little bit better. And valuing someone's contribution, which we don't know what that is until we start talking about it. So when we have these cultures that aren't communicating, these are the kinds of challenges that are arising and coming up without them really knowing it. So that, I think, that's the first example anyway that popped to mind with that question, Julian.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, because it really clarifies what you were talking about very early on in the interview. Starting out with, I was frustrated, and speaking for you, but frustrated by doing the one-day presentation skill training, and now hearing you use this example and everything you've told us, with this lens of unmuted. It's fascinating to me how it's so much more than purely presentational, or it's really about communication with a capital C. And I would even go so far as to say that it's actually really about collaboration as well. It sounds like you're improving, the interpersonal communications and collaborative efforts that people are going through, and facilitating that so that it's more efficient, more effective, more productive, and people just feel a greater sense of belonging.
Yeah. And it's funny, because when I wrote the book, I don't think I truly grasped that I didn't truly see that underneath it all, this book is really about inclusion. It's about belonging. It's about making sure that every single voice is heard. It's actually a diversity and inclusion book, which that wasn't really in my mind when I wrote it. It was all about communication and culture. And that was my goal in showing a more holistic view of communication and how it works and what we can achieve with better communication. But the end goal of that is truly to ensure every voice is heard and every voice belongs. And that's really a story about inclusion and belonging and collaboration, as you say. So it is much bigger than that. I was on another podcast once, and the host started by saying, well, this is usually a podcast about leadership, but today we're going to talk about communication. And I said, what? I said, communication is leadership. You cannot be a leader without communication. Communication is everything. And how we have somehow detached and made communication a separate topic from strategy and leadership and everything else. I don't know how, when, where that happened, but it did. And really, communication is the foundation of everything. Maybe I'm biased. Maybe that's just the filter through which I see the entire world. But for me, I don't know how we can create anything without communication.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's so important, what we're talking about today and what you're doing, because, it's like what you were talking about earlier when a client comes to you and says, well, we're not quite happy with this person's professional presence, and all these different codes that they're such blanket terms that it's very hard to understand what it actually means. And so you have to ask all these follow-up questions, and communication has become that. It's a term that's a blanket term, and it's used for many, many different things. And I think it does seem like, it's like communication equals presentation. When actually communication is so much deeper than that and so much broader than that. And it includes presence, it includes collaboration, it includes all these different things. So I think the more, I'm pointing to all three of us and the many listeners on this podcast, the many guests we've had, that's really one of our goals here when you say, Jules, to sort of, the more we have conversations like this, the more specific we become in our use of language and in our use of terms, so that they become defined in such a way that my goal is to eradicate blanket terms, that end up being meaningless. And unfortunately, I think you're right, Heather. And I think, to me, that's my diagnostic, is that communication just has become kind of a throwaway word. And so bringing it back to like this conversation and what it really means and what the implications are, I think is key, really crucial.
For me, it's to develop some awareness. I have like lower goals, but I think if we can use this to have awareness and what it could be, I know it can bridge a gap, and also be curious about others' cultures. I know the beauty of language, expressions that exist. I remember being in college many years ago, a friend of mine is from Japan, and I would speak about something and she goes, there's a phrase in Japanese for this. So the beauty of the language and the culture and the lessons we can learn when we take a moment to listen can really bridge quite a bit in a group and build some trust. How many of us have had expression? And I know as a female, like watching one person speak, have a very good idea in a meeting, but they are not the right level of the organization, have somebody else, unfortunately it was a man in a lot of cases, recap, say it in a booming voice, and everyone's like, that was wise. And you're like, hello, like it just went down the table, it was just repackaged. So like what were we all complicit in sometimes too?
Exactly. And that's a part of the conversation. Yeah. And that's another part that's so important, that we learn how to speak up and talk about those situations. When we hear someone parrot something that was just said by usually a minority voice, whether it's a woman or an ethnic minority or whatever minority we want to think about, and it's parroted by someone, that we speak up and say, isn't that what so-and-so just said? I think you're actually saying the same as what this person just said, just in a slightly different way. But I actually think that's what, we need to be allies in that case. And I do recommend that for people who have difficulty speaking up or feel like they're talked over or feel like their ideas are taken, that you actually find an ally. You find one of those loud voices that you can depend on to stand up for you in those meetings, in those situations, because it is very difficult to do it yourself. But it's so easy for someone else to step in and say, whoa, hold on a second. Did I just hear you say what she just said? Yeah, I think so. And so we need to build those relationships as well, and to be really good allies for one another. And that's not only around language. I mean, it's around all areas of diversity and inclusion, but we need to be better at that. Those of us who do, and that's where the loud voices can be. That's one of those really good things about the loud voices. They're the perfect ones to step in and focus on making sure every voice is heard and balancing for that inclusion.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I think this is great advice. I have a question for you, Heather, which we ask of all our guests, and that is if you could tell us about an experience that has shaped who you are today, and perhaps even still shapes who you are today.
The one that stands out the most for me, it's what completely changed the way I approach my work. Because before moving into corporate training, I was teaching English. So I had, a very specific idea of There's good English and there's bad English, and you need to speak the way the textbook says. And of course, the grammar has to be correct and the pronunciation must be this way. And, a very bubble view of the world as an American, as everything. And I meet this COO of a company who's asked me to come in and help him with his articulation and presentation skills. And he's Singapore, no, he was Chinese Malaysian, living in Singapore for many, many, many years. And in our whole conversation, I can hear him making, little grammar mistakes. And at this time, I still have my true English teacher hat on. And I'm hearing lots of little grammar things, dropped S's, dropped endings, dropped this and that, and tenses a little bit confused. I could understand everything he said, but there were definitely some grammar areas. And so I just said to him, I said, and what about your grammar? Is this an area you also want to look at? Did you want me to be helping you with any of this? And he just looks at me, he goes, my grammar? No one cares about my grammar. As long as they can understand me, that's good enough. And that was like knife in the chest for an English teacher to hear, right? But as I reflected on it, I thought, he's absolutely right. Who do I think I am sitting here being the grammar police? He's a COO of a multinational company. He runs all of Asia, China, Southeast Asia, Pacific. And I'm sitting here trying to tell him and correct his grammar. Who am I to do that? It was such a massive wake-up call about how the world actually works, how the language is actually used in real life. A good reminder that we don't communicate the way the textbooks tell us to, that we don't sound like the MP3, now MP3 recordings, used to be cassette tape when I started. but we don't talk like that. We don't sound like that. We don't use the language like that. And isn't the real communication in the understanding? And isn't that what we should be focused on? Who has time to be correcting everyone's email? Who cares? If you understood it, that should be good enough. And that's how real communication happens. And it was that consultation that completely changed the rest of my career. That's where, 8 years later, I ended up doing the TEDx on 2 billion voices, how to speak bad English perfectly, because it came from that realization that there is no good or bad. If communication has happened and understanding is happening, then whatever language you used was perfect. And that conversation, that experience just changed everything and continues to change the way I look at the world and approach my work. And it was an incredibly important lesson for me. And he's still a very good friend. And he's now recently retired. He became president of all of Asia. And this is an American company. And I think that's also very important to point out, that it was an American company. So he was reporting to a board of directors and C-suite in the US, and he was in charge of all of Asia, which was the most profitable group out of this American company, bigger than the American market, South American, European markets. So incredibly talented, brilliant man. And to hear him say that just changed everything for me. And he just recently retired last October.
Yeah. Well, you're going to have to send him this podcast and his big shout out, a global thank you and acknowledgement.
Yeah, he knows it. And he's one of the endorsements of Unmuted as well. So I won't mention his name now. He wouldn't mind if I did, but very important person in my career path for sure.
Wow. Well, thank you. I really appreciate your answer, and it gives just another layer, right, in all these different dimensions that we've heard kind of influence your work, and I really appreciate this lens that you've made us and our listeners discover. I'll speak for myself, and I'm sure a lot of other people. We've had many guests talking about DEI, but this is a really unique perspective, and such an important one, and one that I think a lot of us take for granted and are not really conscious of. So thank you for elevating my consciousness. I really appreciate that. It's been a true discovery for me. So thanks.
Oh, well, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I am so passionate about these topics and love any opportunity to talk about it, because I think you're right. We don't think about it. And then once we realize it's happening, we see it everywhere.
Yeah. Yes.
So I hope that the listeners, if they haven't thought about this before, they're going to suddenly watch a television show and think, why does that person have an accent? And what does that mean? And that's funny that they chose to make that character sound that way. The way that we depict people and stereotype people. And as you start looking around your meetings and wondering, why is this person typically quiet? And what's their linguistic background or cultural background? And how does that impact the way they're interacting? And are they just more introverted? And how can I support them so that they can speak up? So I do hope that we begin to start viewing our interactions from that lens.
For sure.
Absolutely. So I want to remind our listeners before we go of a couple of different resources here, and we're going to be adding these to the episode notes as well, so people can click on those links. But the one is the TEDx talk that we talked about, which is titled 2 Billion Voices: How to Speak Bad English Perfectly, and also the book Unmuted, which has been published back in March 2022. So that's available. Is there anything else, Heather, that you would want to point our listeners to? I'm actually just remembering your website that you mentioned with the assessment.
Yeah, the assessment is at heatherhansen.com, and just /unmuted is all the information about the book, the assessment, everything is there. Another really great resource is a podcast that NPR did, the podcast Rough Translation. And they did a story called Bad English, where they had found my TEDx. And so they brought me in and we talked a lot about this concept of bad English and this realization through my career of focusing on understanding. And they did a really excellent job bringing in all kinds of international voices. So that's another really great resource that I'd recommend if people are interested specifically in this topic.
So listen to this and buy the book in bulk.
That's right. Exactly. Get everyone in your organization to read the book. Well, really fantastic. Thanks so much for being here, Heather, and for taking the time. I know, it's not easy with the time difference being in Singapore and us in the US. So really appreciate.
Well, it's easier for me starting my day. You're the one staying up late for me. So thank you for that. And thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, of course. And of course, I want to thank you, Jules, for being my wonderful co-host, and thank our listeners. And I want to remind everyone that we have a fall offering, which consists of a 3-part workshop series. It's all going to be online. It's called Leading with Story, and you can learn more at narrative.com/leadingwithstory workshop about how you can find, craft, and tell a powerful leadership story of your own in a safe and supportive environment over the course of 3 one-hour sessions online.
Yes, and how we lead now in these current times is more important than ever. So it's important. And if you prefer for your group to be in a private session where you're all together with your team, we will work with you and collaborate to give you the best experience for that.
Great. Well, as always, thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And also remember that we're publishing these on our YouTube channel as well. And all of this drives word of mouth. So please spread the word. Until next time. Thanks, Jules. Thanks, Heather. See you all.
For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narrative.com.